Okay, today we will be discussing what I call the Church of the Middle Ages Part 2, Lecture 16. This starts on page 299 of the larger lecture notes, or of course you have the smaller section linked there on Joule. I feel like it's important to, again, draw a timeline up on the board just to make sure that we kind of are all on the same page with regard to the chronological sequence of when these events are taking place. At this point in the class, we are covering a large number of centuries and years in a short period of time. That's intentional because in terms of theological and doctrinal development, the Middle Ages don't present the same level of advancement and development that the early patristic era represents. It's the foundational era, the era then of the Christianized Roman Empire. Kind of goes into a little bit of static mode when we get into the Middle Ages. There is some development, but it's not to the same degree as we saw in those first 500 years. So the next 1,000 years is something that we can cover, maybe not quite in a day. 1,000 years in this class is more like 4 weeks than a day, but we can cover that period of time in a relatively quick pace, because of the nature of the events that took place there. So we're really going bird's eye view here, but what I want to help you see is the sequence and the flow so that you have in your mind a framework for explaining why the Reformation was necessary. Why do we need a Reformation in the 16th century? That's answered. That question is answered as we look at the developments that did take place during the Middle Ages. So if we look here at the early Middle Ages, and we have the fall of Rome in 476, which begins for us this period of time known as the Middle Ages. And we're going to come all the way up in our look at the early Middle Ages to 1054 with the Great Schism, which is the divide between the eastern half and the western half of the Roman Church. But as we'll see in today's lecture, that division has already started to take place really by the 8th century. When we get to the 11th century, it's almost a foregone conclusion. It's just made official in 1054. Some of the other important anchor dates that we have in this period of time in the early Middle Ages, we had a little bit before this in 451, the Council of Chalcedon. And we spent some time on Tuesday talking about the leadership of a guy named Leo the Great, and the elevation, the beginnings of the elevation of the Bishop of Rome to what will become really the full-fledged papacy by the time we get into the 10th and 11th century as we discuss that today. So part of the purpose of this is to demonstrate the development of the papacy itself and then the corruption of the papacy, because the Reformation was as much a reaction against what the papacy itself had become as it was anything else. Another council in 553 was the Second Council of Constantinople. And that corresponds then with the reign in the east of an emperor named Justinian, who believed it was his divine calling to go and reconquer the western part of the Roman Empire that had been lost. And in his efforts, he spent so much money and expended so much manpower in this effort to reconquer the West that he ended up actually creating something of a power vacuum that the armies of Islam were able to conquer easily when Islam itself came on the scene. Now, if we're looking for the birth of Muhammad, we would say around 570 was the birth of Muhammad, the death of Muhammad, 632. And really from 632 up until 732, we have a period of incredible Islamic expansion. And this isn't a major date, but in 637, you have the fall of Jerusalem to Muslim armies. So from 637 on, Jerusalem is in Muslim hands, and that will become important when we start to talk about the Crusades, which the Crusades are a little bit after this timeline that we're drawing on the board in the High Middle Ages or the Late Middle Ages. This Islamic expansion really causes Christians in the East in particular, because it's the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire as it becomes known, that is really affected by this, and they begin to question certain theological things that we'll talk about here in just a moment. A little bit before this, the other name that we talked about on Tuesday was Gregory, and Leo is in the west, Justinian is in the east, Gregory is back in the west, and he is known as the Great Missionary Pope because of the missionary strategies that he employed in order to reach out specifically to some of the barbarian tribal groups in Europe, among them the Western Goths in Spain and the Angles and the Saxons in Britain. And through his efforts, we had the conversion then of some of these tribal groups. And this will become important because Christianity will become the unifying factor among these Germanic tribal groups, which eventually become the nations of Europe. But it's Christianity that unites Europe, with the Pope being the de facto spiritual leader among all of those various tribal groups. Okay, so that brings us then up to where we're at. And today we want to kind of start here and move forward up to the Great Schism of 1054. One other date that we've already talked about in this class would be two other dates. 680, the Third Council of Constantinople, and 787, the Second Council of Nicaea. And it's the Second Council of Nicaea and the Islamic expansion that gives us the context for what we're going to start talking about here with the Iconoclast Controversy that erupted in the East. All right, but I kind of want you to be able to keep in your mind this framework that we're building, because there's a lot of details and other things, and what I want you to leave this class with is something of a working outline of the first 1,500 years of church history, so that you could explain to someone why a Reformation was necessary in the West based on the flow and development of things that happened over the previous 1,000 years during the Middle Ages. All right, the Iconoclast Controversy. This is actually a really fascinating part of church history, and we're going to spend a little bit of time discussing it. In some ways, the Iconoclast Controversy sounds a lot like the storyline or the plot line from one of the Star Wars movies. And I think this will become clear as we discuss this, because you have an emperor and an empire that represents one particular viewpoint, and eventually you have a rebellion, a resistance. It begins as an underground movement, but it eventually defies the empire, and through the political maneuverings of a princess, and ultimately two princesses, the resistance triumphs over the empire.
Does this mean that we could do our historical theology project on Star Wars?
No, because the things that happened in Star Wars happened a long, long time ago, and your project has to be within the 1,500 years of the history that we're studying. All right. Due primarily to the military losses that the eastern half of the Roman Empire was experiencing during this time period, largely as a result of the explosive Islamic expansion that took place after Muhammad died in 632 over those next few decades, leading up to the century that then ended at the Battle of Tours in 732, when the Franks finally pushed back the Muslim advance in Europe. Due to this vast Muslim expansion, the Christians in the East began to wonder what was wrong. They began to assume that they were under some sort of divine judgment because their armies kept losing battle after battle, city after city that was being conceded to the Muslim advance. Something must be wrong, they assumed, and they began to look at what it was that they were doing that perhaps could be the explanation for why God was not enabling their armies to have victory over the Muslims. The emperor found his cause, or so he believed, in the practice of venerating icons, which was something that had slowly developed within the Roman Empire after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, as nominal Christians slowly began to reincorporate really the worship of pagan deities, but to do so under new names. And so instead of Saturn and Jupiter and Mercury, we now have Peter and Paul and other apostles and saints. And instead of quote-unquote worshiping them, we're venerating them, but the line between veneration and worship was really, really hard to distinguish. So this process takes place over time, and we'll read a little bit about that here in a moment. But by the time we get to the 8th century, it's pretty well entrenched in both the West and the East that icons, statues, figurines, paintings, stained glass windows portraying different figures, that these have become part of the worship practice of both Eastern and Western Christians. Now, this causes some controversy, especially when the armies of the East keep getting defeated, because there are those who don't feel comfortable with this practice in the church. They believe that it is a form of idolatry. And those who would then accuse the use of icons in the church, those who would allege that that practice is really idolatry, they become known as iconoclasts. Iconoclasts. Iconoclasm means those who are opposed to icons. In 695, for example, when the Emperor Justinian II minted coins with the image of Christ on the coin, the iconoclasts were outraged because they felt that this was a form of idolatry. In part, their concern came out of the Monophysite-Diophysite controversy. Remember that controversy that we've been talking about? And we had the Second Council of Constantinople and the Third Council of Constantinople taking place right around these time periods, where people are arguing about the two natures of Christ versus the one nature of Christ. And it's the dual nature of Christ that ultimately prevails, and rightly so, as a accurate representation of how Christ is presented in Scripture. But people who were committed to seeing both Christ's humanity and his deity fully and simultaneously represented, they feared that an image of Christ would only showcase one nature, his humanity, because you can't aptly demonstrate his deity in an image. That was part of their argument. That was part of their concern. They were also then additionally concerned that making an image of the Lord Jesus constituted a violation of the second commandment. The second commandment is where God commands the Israelites not to make an image of him. And so here we have Christians making an image of the Son of God. Isn't that in some way a violation of the second commandment? That was part of their argument. Now, By the way, when we move forward to the Reformation, many of the reformers, especially Zwingli and what becomes known as the Reformed movement, they will be iconoclastic in their view, and they will use that argument from the Second Commandment to support their iconoclasm. Even today, there are some conservative Presbyterian groups that still don't want any image of Christ to be made because they believe it's a violation of the Second Commandment. So this is an argument that goes all the way back to the 8th century, but it's still an argument that shows up today. And if you pick up a children's Bible story book published by a conservative Presbyterian publishing company, you won't find any pictures of Jesus in that book. It'll just be his hand or his sleeve or the hem of his garment that you'll see. You won't actually ever see him, because that would, in their minds, be a violation of the Second Commandment. So you can see that iconoclasm still exists, though I think most Protestant groups are a little bit more moderate in their iconoclasm than some of the more conservative Presbyterians. The iconodules, this is the resistance movement. So the iconoclasts represent the empire. Now, in this version of our retelling of the Star Wars plot through church history, the empire actually represents, I think, the right side of the issue. But in any case, the iconodules, they represent the resistance movement because they are supporters of the icons. And that's essentially what iconodule means. They're pro-icon. And their argument back is, in the person of Jesus Christ, God himself made an image of the invisible God. In fact, the book of Hebrews says that Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God. So to recreate or to depict an image of Christ is not a violation of the Second Commandment, because it is simply a reflection of what God himself did in the incarnation. So that was their response to that particular part of the argument. They also argued that they were not worshiping the icons, but that they were simply venerating or reverencing the icons. And this is where I think that the iconodules, and iconodualism is represented in the modern Greek Orthodox and modern Roman Catholic churches, and it is still represented to some extent in some Lutheran churches, since Luther himself was not nearly as much of an iconoclast as Zwingli and Calvin and those of the Reformed movement. I realize we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I think it's helpful to see how some of this has trickled down into contemporary Christian circles. So the iconodules, they argue that they're not worshiping the icons. But the reality is that that line between veneration and worship is often very, very blurry. And when we get to even modern times, I think that line between veneration and worship is still extremely blurry, especially when it comes to the veneration of Mary, where if we're going to pray to somebody and kneel down before somebody and light candles before somebody and, cross ourselves and do other things in a person's name, and even elevate a person to co-mediator or co-redeemer, that we have crossed the line big time between respect and worship. So, in my mind, that line gets crossed, and it gets crossed in a big way between reverence and idolatry. But in any case, this is where the controversy in church history initially brews, and where it spills over, and the ramifications are still felt today. So around 730, it's actually in the year 726, but around 730, Emperor Leo III ordered that an icon of Christ, which was prominently featured at the entrance to the Palace of Constantinople, so a big picture of Christ. And you can appreciate an icon from a Greek Orthodox perspective, because a lot of the pictures that I've used in this class are really Greek Orthodox icons. They're kind of a very two-dimensional way of depicting some of these saints and biblical figures. So there's an icon of Christ, which is replaced then with a simple cross. And again, Leo's primary motivation for this is that he thinks the reason his armies keep getting beat by the Muslims is because they run around and parade these icons everywhere. In fact, in a lot of these cities, the cities were supposedly protected by an icon. And then the city would be defeated and taken over by Muslims, and people would scratch their heads and say, what happened? How come the icon didn't protect us? And then you have monks running around saying, well, it's not the icon, it's the faith of the people in the icon. And much like modern prosperity faith healers, they blame the faith of the people, not the superstitious method behind it. So Leo III bans icons. And here we have a major controversy in the making. Germanus I, who was the patriarch of Constantinople at the time, he opposed the ban that was put on icons by the emperor, and as a result, he gets removed, and this begins the resistance movement. Pope Gregory I believe it's actually Pope Gregory II. I think that's a typo there in the notes. But Pope Gregory condemns Leo's actions. When Leo dies, his son Constantine V continues the ban on icons. When Constantine dies, his son Leo IV continues the ban on icons. In fact, Constantine V held a council called the Council of Hieria in 754, where the bishops came together. Now, this did not involve bishops from the west. It was only bishops from the east. But they came together in 754 and they pronounced that icons ought to be banned. So as of 754, the Greek Orthodox Church was officially icon-free, and they had a council to support it. Well, when Leo IV died, his wife, Irene, who was secretly an iconodule, became the co-regent of the empire, and she undid the iconoclasm of her husband, her husband's father, and her husband's grandfather. So Leo III, Constantine V, Leo IV, all iconoclasts. Leo IV dies, Irene, secret iconodule, comes to power, and icons are back in. Irene was not a man. Irene was the queen. She was the wife of Leo IV. So when her husband died, she became co-regent along with their son, and as a result of that was able to reintroduce icons. It is in that context, then, that we have the Second Council of Nicaea, because it is Irene who convenes the Second Council of Nicaea, and the Second Council of Nicaea overturns the Council of Hieria and restores the practice and veneration of icons to churches in the East. Now, the Pope in the West sent two delegates. It was Pope Adrian, or Pope Hadrian, sometimes spelled with an H, who sent two delegates to that council. And so then this council is considered the seventh Ecumenical Council. It's the last of the major councils that we talked about in this class, because it represented delegates from both the West and the East. And the Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches both look back to the Second Council of Nicaea as the affirmation from church history for the promotion and veneration of icons within their church services. Yeah, Matthew.
We don't have anything now as far as evangelical that would be sort of like a council where, as believers, we get together to say what's okay, what isn't okay.
Yeah, in terms of modern church councils, we really don't have any parallel to these ancient ecumenical councils. It would be pretty much impossible, I think, today to organize any kind of council that anyone would regard as representing all of the branches of Christendom and as being authoritative in its findings for those various branches. We do have, within conservative evangelical circles, we do have times where people come together to discuss doctrinal issues. I'm thinking of like the Together for the Gospel Conference, or even the Evangelical Theological Society meetings where the scholars from evangelicalism come together and discuss ideas. But none of those things carry with them the authority that these councils carried with them. These councils were possible because it was really emperors who were mandating that these councils took place and that the findings of these councils be observed by all of the churches within the Roman Empire. But you're right, there's not really any modern equivalent. And we've already talked a little bit about the Second Council of Nicaea and about the fact that it's at this point that evangelicals have jumped off the train, so to speak. We're not in support of the findings of the Second Council of Nicaea because we view the veneration of icons as really spilling over into idolatry because, again, that fine line between veneration and worship, false worship, is really, really fuzzy, and I think in many cases doesn't even exist. I think the veneration is a form of false worship. Yep.
What's the first known use of icons in the way in which you describe veneration?
Yeah, the first known use, I don't know that we have an exact date that we could narrow it down to. It was more of a gradual process resulting from the Christianization of pagan Roman religion, where slowly over time those pagan practices re-entered and infiltrated the Christian church and were Christianized in the process. So now the way we used to, we being people in Rome, the way we used to pray to pagan Roman deities, we are now going to venerate Christian and biblical saints. And in many ways, the superstitions that had previously surrounded pagan Roman practice now come to surround the way in which people regard biblical characters and historical heroes. Yeah, we'll read about that a little bit in just a moment. Yep.
I got two questions. Did you say that this council was the last major council because it involved the East and the West?
Yeah, this is considered the last ecumenical council. And when we talk about ecumenical, that word means worldwide. Of course, by this point, it's not really worldwide. It's just all of the churches within the Roman Empire, both of the East and the West. There will still be councils that the Western Church holds, but they will just be Western Church councils. The Council of Trent or the Council of Vatican I and Vatican II would be examples of Western Catholic councils. So those kinds of councils still exist, but no one outside of the Catholic Church itself regards those councils as being authoritative.
Okay. And the second question was, because evangelicals today don't recognize this council as being biblically sound, what was the percentage of true believers who took place, or who took part in this council versus the ones who they would probably labeled as heretics?
Yeah. You know, I don't know that we can answer that question with any degree of absolute precision. We do know, of course, that there was a major movement to try and get rid of icons. So this was a major clash, especially in the East, between those who wanted to get rid of icons and those who wanted to keep the icons. You know, and there were those even who supported the use of icons who tried to argue vehemently that this is not a form of false worship. These are tools and instruments that aid people in their worship. I think ultimately those arguments fall flat, but I do think that it's perhaps possible for true Christians to have made those kinds of arguments. We are at a time period now where the Roman Catholic Church, as we think of it today, it has not officially made its sacramental synergistic form of work salvation part of what it teaches. There are seeds of that corruption, but the corruption is not full-fledged. So I would say that we're at a time period now where the church is in the process of apostatizing, but that apostatization has not been final. I don't think that happens until the High Middle Ages, around the year 1200 or so. So we're still kind of in process. So how to answer that question is tough, because it's a time of process and transition as we see these human traditions creeping in, and the result is that the seeds of corruption are slowly obscuring the gospel of grace, and yet that gospel hasn't been totally obscured yet. Yep. All right, so we're at the point here where we've had 3 generations of leaders who have all been iconoclasts, and then along comes the wife of the last generation and undoes all of it, right? Well, it's going to happen again. The iconoclasts were not done. In the 9th century, in 814, Leo V again reinstates a ban on icons. His son, Michael II, also an iconoclast. His grandson, Theophilus, also an iconoclast. Again, no icons, because this is idolatry, and God is judging us for our idolatry, and that's why we're losing on the battlefield. So maybe superstitious motives, but this is the theological reasoning that is behind all of this. Well, what happens? When Theophilus dies in 842, his wife, Theodora, becomes co-regent with their son. She is a closet iconodule. And once again, she reinstates icons for use in the church in the East. And after Theodora then, after the mid part of the 9th century, icons are no longer really challenged in the East. They become a full-fledged part of Eastern Orthodox practice. And in the West, the western part of the church had supported icons during this whole period of time, and so the popes in the West were glad to have the Church of the East join them in their support and use of icons in worship. So it's kind of an interesting story. You've got the 3 generations of empires, and then the wife of the third overturns the whole deal, and it doesn't just happen once, it happens twice. You know, they say history repeats itself. It's not always this blatant, but it's kind of fun to see how it all unfolded. And in the 8th and 9th centuries, the Iconoclast Controversy was a major, major controversy that was taking place. Yep.
Is that representative of the whole thing? Like, women were more so leaning toward the icons and the men weren't? Or is that just a coincidence?
You know, I don't know the answer to that in terms of demographic support for one issue over the other. I feel like there's been a lot of talk on the radio recently about demographic support of issues. I don't know if it was the kind of thing where, in general, women were more inclined towards the icons and men were not. I don't think that's the case. I think it's more of just one of those providential coincidences of history that we had 2 particular queens who supported the iconodule movement, and when they got the opportunity to be in power, they saw to it that the iconoclast policies of their husbands and their fathers-in-law and their grandfathers-in-law were overturned. But yeah, it is kind of interesting. I don't know that we can draw any firm conclusions from it, but it is kind of interesting. All right, I want to read just, I'm switching over to a different document here. This is not something that's in your notes, but we're going to read a little bit from Eric Russell Chamberlain this morning, a little bit on the Iconoclast Controversy, and then a little bit on what was happening with regard to the papacy. Chamberlain wrote a book back in the 1960s called The Bad Popes, and it's actually a really fascinating book. If you're interested in what happened in Roman Catholic circles and development during the Middle Ages, this is a book that you need to read. It outlines the utter corruption of the papacy from about the 9th century through the 14th century or so. And when you start to study and understand just how corrupt the papacy became during that time, it becomes very clear that a reformation was desperately needed by the time we get to the 16th century. Here he's talking specifically about the implications of the Iconoclast controversy for the West. So just follow along as I read a little bit here. He says, there was no major clash between emperor and bishop on purely religious matters. That's the emperor of the East and the bishop of Rome, until about 726. This is when we have Leo III of Byzantium, or of Constantinople, starting his iconoclast policies. The reigning emperor was Leo III, by birth a hillman, and by training a soldier, a simple, direct man who brought to the complexities of religious disputations a simple, direct approach. It was disastrous. His Christian subjects had nothing but praise for his edict that commanded the forcible baptism of Jews. But when he issued the first of his iconoclastic edicts, he spelled the doom of his empire in the West. The people of Italy were touched for the first time on a universally personal matter. The primitive Christians had attacked, that's meaning the early Christians, had attacked image worship as the work of the devil, and there had been wholesale destruction of every type of idol when Christianity had at last triumphed in the Roman Empire. But over the succeeding centuries, the images crept back, appearing under new names, but to the critical eye with an identical role. So these pagan idols came back into Christianity, but just with different names. It was the Christians of the East who first began to feel that much of the pagan religion that their forefathers had destroyed at such cost in martyrs' blood was insensibly being restored. So paganism was coming back in. Disturbed by the mockery of the neighboring iconoclastic Muslims, their devotion to images was in addition subjected to a strain of which their Western brethren were free. So it was in the East that they felt this tension. In a decade, the infidel Muslims had overcome city after Christian city. This is in the 630s and 640s, each of which had been under the protection of some holy image. In vain, monks made the standard defense of supernatural prophylactics that it was the lack of faith of the possessor, not the lack of virtue in the image, which rendered it useless. That's what I was saying earlier. The religious disputation inevitably became political, bringing with it riots and the ever-present threat of civil war. The forthright Leo resolved the problem, as he thought, by coming down on the side of the iconoclasts. In 726, he issued his edict commanding the breaking of all images throughout the empire in the West as well as the East. Well, Pope Gregory supported the use of images, and he defied the emperor's decree. Gregory returned again and again to the theme that he and his followers did not worship but only reverenced images. So the emperor is saying, look, this is worship. And the Pope is saying, no, it's just veneration. But, Chamberlain notes, in referring to a threat of direct attack upon the great statue of St. Peter in Rome, Gregory slipped into a curious and ambiguous phraseology. Now remember, this is Gregory II, not Gregory I, who we talked about on Tuesday. He himself had no fear of the emperor's rage. He said, I have but to retire 24 miles into the Campania, and you might as well follow the winds. But for the statue of St. Peter himself, which all the kingdoms of the West esteem as a god on earth, the whole West would take a terrible revenge, unquote. Whether he intended it to be understood that it was the statue or Peter himself whom the West held as a god on earth, the statement could have helped little to repudiate the charge that Europe was fast falling into idolatry. So, he's saying it's only veneration, it's only veneration. And then he says the statue of St. Peter is a god on earth. Well, that's a problem. And that, I think, illustrates that very blurry line between veneration and false worship. As a result of the Pope's defiance, a battle broke out between imperial forces of the East and papal forces of the West. This is in the 700s. So we haven't officially split in 1054, but you can see how a split becomes inevitable. Chamberlain concludes with this. He says, after the violence of open warfare had abated, there remained still a nominal allegiance to the emperor. Gregory himself had no intention of usurping the temporal power, but had charted a path that others could not fail to follow. Just 9 months after his death, in 731, the effective severance with the East was made when a synod in Rome pronounced excommunicate all those who would attack the images of the saints. So they made their stand in the West. Eventually in 787, the East agrees with them, and there's something of a reunification. It will be broken up again in 1054. So here then, the emperor and his theologians alike were rejected by Italy, and it was inevitable that the Bishop of Rome should fill the vacuum of power thus created. So we've been talking a lot about how there's no emperor in the West. There's no emperor in the West, and the Pope fills that office, that vacuum. And even after Justinian reconquers the West, and they hold on to the West for some period of time, by the time we get to the 8th century, again, the Pope is defying the emperor, and the Pope is filling in the emperor's shoes. And so the pastor becomes the president, I suppose, would be a way of making it, modernizing it for our American mindset. Okay. That brings us back over then to the Church of the West. And remember, we've been kind of ping-ponging our way back and forth between East and West. We started in the West with Leo, then to the East with Justinian, then back to the West with Gregory I, then back to the East with the Iconoclast Controversy. And we can now add that to our timeline here. Now we get to the establishment of the European Holy Roman Empire.
So was it
David.
the controversy, was it kind of both because they're losing the battles and people don't believe in having icons, or was that kind of the two big reasons why, or was it just because people didn't believe in icons? What would you?
Yeah, in the East, I think there was legitimate concern that this represented idolatry. And along with that legitimate concern was kind of a cause and effect. That we're losing these battles, that's the effect. What's the cause? Well, the cause is that these icons, this is really a form of idolatry. So there was, I think, a genuine concern that this represented some form of idol worship, and that the ramifications and consequences of that were serious and significant military defeat. And there's no questioning the fact that during this time period, the Eastern Empire experienced serious military setbacks. All of North Africa was lost. Much of the Middle East was lost. The Byzantine Empire after this time period represents essentially modern-day Turkey and Greece, and that's about it, because everything in what is today Israel and Syria and Lebanon is lost to the Muslim armies. And they will continue to push and push and push until the Byzantine Empire in the 1400s is essentially the city of Istanbul. And when it finally falls, it's over. All right, we have already discussed the fact that in the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans. I put 732 up here because this is the Battle of Tours, where Charles Martel pushed back the Muslims from Frankish territory. Charles Martel is the grandfather of Charles the Great, and if we Latinize his name, it becomes Charlemagne. So Charlemagne just means Charles the Magnificent, Charles the Great. While the Eastern Church was arguing about icons, the Western Church was making alliances with the Franks, who had emerged in Europe as the most powerful of these, the most dominant of these Germanic tribal groups. 687, we have a little bit of the development of the Carolinian Dynasty. We have Pippin of Herstal, and then his son Charles Martel, who we just mentioned is the one who defeated the Muslims in 732 at the Battle of Tours. Charles's two sons, Carloman and Pippin the Short. Pippin the Short becomes the king, and his two sons then are Carloman and Charles, and Charles the Great, as he becomes known. Charlemagne emerges as the ruler of this empire. A little bit of context here. And I need to include this in future renditions of the notes, but in the 700s, there was a document that was produced. We don't know exactly when it was written. They think that a man named Christophorus, I believe was his name, is the one who put it together. And we'll read a little bit about it here in a moment if we have time. But there was a document known as the Donation of Constantine. The Donation of Constantine, which was produced as a forgery. And essentially what this forgery did was it rewrote history and said that when Constantine left Rome and went and established his capital city in Constantinople, that Constantine, as he left, essentially ceded the lands of Rome and some of the other cities around Rome to the current bishop of Rome at that time. I believe his name was Sylvester. And so according to the Donation of Constantine, Constantine himself, by imperial decree, made the bishop of Rome the ruler of Rome and the surrounding areas. Now, that didn't actually happen. This is a forgery. But the forgery claims, then, based on historic precedent and imperial decree of Constantine himself, that the Pope is the one who actually is the ruler in Rome and the surrounding areas, and therefore he is superior to any Roman emperor of the East. So this is another separation between East and West, gradual separations that take place until the final one in 1054, but the Pope is now regarded as being not only the pastor in Rome, but as having, by imperial decree, an opportunity to fulfill the emperor's position. So the donation then is Constantine giving Rome and the surrounding areas to the Pope. And so this document is called the Donation of Constantine because it outlines the history, supposed history, of that event. This document becomes a very powerful piece of proof within Roman circles in the 8th and 9th century as these various factions within Rome vie for political power. They really vie for the papacy itself because of the political power that it comes to represent as a result of this document, which puts the Pope in charge. Now, by the time we get to the 1400s, and even before that, the Donation of Constantine will have been proven to be false. It's a forgery. It's a fraud. And yet, at this time period, everyone believes that it's real. And so the popes are able to convince emperors, including the leader of the Franks, and the emperor in Byzantium, in Istanbul, in Constantinople, same city, 3 different names, that the Pope is really the rightful ruler of this Roman territory. There's another group called the Lombards. This is another one of those tribal groups. And the Lombards have grown to a position of power. That's a Christian tribe, but they are threatening Rome at this time. And so Pope Hadrian wants to force the Lombards to give back all of the land that they've taken, which has encroached on Roman territory. And so Pope Hadrian goes up to meet with Pepin the Short, and he convinces him to come down and kick out the Lombards and reinstate papal authority there. And he does all of this on the basis of this forged document called the Donation of Constantine. So the Donation of Constantine becomes actually a really important document in the history of all of this. And so it's something that you need to know about. It's something that you'll read about in Olson, and something that I need to include in this section of notes in future lectures. As a result of all of this, then, there is an alliance that is forged between the Franks and the papacy, and this eventually leads to Hadrian's successor, Leo III. In order to quell a riot, he goes up and asks Pippin the Short's successor, Charlemagne, to come help him. Charlemagne comes down, and in response, Leo crowns him King of the Romans, or Emperor of the Romans, on Christmas Day 800. So this new political alliance now between the Western Roman Pope and the leader of the Carolinian Dynasty is forged in the late 8th, early 9th century. This again represents part of the shift and the split that's taking place between the East and the West. All right, along those lines, I want to read just a little bit more, and I apologize for doing reading, but I think it's really helpful and interesting. This also comes from Chamberlain's book. In fact, let me show you the cover of the book so you can see what it looks like. It's called The Bad Popes by Eric Russell Chamberlain. And this picture that's here, this painting, I suppose it's actually it's in the style of an icon. But this painting is supposedly Constantine giving imperial control of Rome and the surrounding areas to Pope or Bishop Sylvester. He wasn't even exclusively called a pope at that time. But you can see Constantine is the one who's bowing before the Pope. So this is putting the Pope in a position above the Emperor. And that painting is a depiction of the donation of Constantine, this false document. So Chamberlain explains a little bit about the document itself. This on page 14 of his book. One of the other reasons that I wanted to read a little bit of this to you is I wanted to remind you of the fact that Google Books is a resource that you should be using for the research that you're doing for your projects. If you're not using Google Books, you're missing a very easy opportunity to find supplemental sources for your research. And the great thing about Google Books is, again, we are looking at the actual page itself. We're not just looking at an HTML version of the document. So when you cite this in your bibliography, you cite it as though you're citing the actual page of the book. Now, I know most of you guys already know how to use Google Books, but for those of you who don't use Google Books, you should use it. I would recommend using it regularly for your research that you do in your seminary papers and projects, but especially for this paper. All right, so yeah, I said Christophicus. It's Christophorus who was the one who did the donation of Constantine. And again, it's a little bit muddy in terms of our understanding of how the donation of Constantine came about, but it was around this time that the idea was that Pope or Bishop Sylvester of Rome was given by Constantine this gift, this donation of the city of Rome and all of the surrounding areas. That never actually happened, but it's going to be used by popes in the 8th and 9th century to make a claim to the city of Rome and the surrounding areas that they are actually the king of those areas because Constantine made them the king. Now, the result of all this, and he goes through all of this and talks about how, as a result of all this, that Pope Stephen at the time, Pope Stephen at the time went up to Pepin, the king of the Franks, and convinced him to come down and kick out the Lombards. And Hadrian was part of that whole history. I'm trying to summarize a lot of information at once. But what's interesting about this is when we get a little bit later after all of this, we start to see the utter corruption of the papacy as a result of the politicization of that office. The fact that the papacy is no longer a spiritual office, but now is both a spiritual and a political office, the fact that the papacy represents some level of absolute authority, and as we know, absolute power corrupts absolutely, the corruption of the papacy becomes almost immediate and inevitable. And he begins then to discuss some of the amazing and corrupt things that took place as a result. So he says here at the end, in the closing years of the 9th century, so that's the late 800s, and now into the 10th century, the early 900s, the faction battles for the chair of Peter, the papacy, brought Rome to the edge of social disintegration. In March of 896, the ghastly Synod Horrenda, which sat in judgment upon a corpse, marked the moment when the city plunged finally into anarchy and delivered as inescapable result the chair of Peter to whosoever was bold enough to ascend to it. And the Synod Horrenda was when the former pope died. The new pope, who represented a rival faction, exhumed his body, dressed him up as the pope, held a trial where they berated this corpse, and then cut off his fingers and did other things to him, and then threw him in the Tiber River out of disgust. And all of this was an attempt to embarrass and humiliate those who were the supporters of that former pope, because the papacy itself became nothing more than a fight between rival factions for political control of Rome and the surrounding areas. So I won't read all the specifics of that Synod Horrenda. You can read it on your own if you want to. You can find this book in Google Books called The Bad Popes. Eventually, a man named Sergius comes to be the pope, and you can just start to see how bad the bloodshed here was. Stephen, the one who was responsible for the Synod Horrenda, was seized and strangled. Despite the loss of their leader, his party remained active and elected a certain Cardinal Sergius as pope. But in a sudden burst of violence, Sergius and most of his followers were chased out of the city. It did not end the battle for the chair of Peter. Over the next 12 months, 4 more popes scrambled onto the blood-stained throne, maintained themselves precariously for a few weeks or even days before being hurled themselves into their graves. So within a year, we had 4 popes. 7 popes and an anti-pope had appeared in a little over 6 years when, with the turn of the century, there came a stay in the rhythm of violence. Sergius reappeared after 7 years, backed now by the swords of a feudal lord who saw a means thereby of gaining entry into Rome. So the whole thing became political. And he goes on to talk about how Sergius himself was called by his successors malignant, unclean, ferocious. And Cardinal Baronius, a papal historian, concluded that the reason such a monster had been unleashed against the church was to show the supernatural strength of its foundations, since no other organization could have resisted such an onslaught from within. So even papal historians recognize that these guys were monsters. And he goes on to talk about some of this corruption. That brings us back then to the notes themselves, because all of this history is intertwining, and I apologize for the fact that maybe it was a little unclear since I was summarizing so much information. But the basis for the corruption of the papacy in the 8th and 9th century, which leads to really the darkest of the dark ages in the 10th century, has to do with this politicization of the papal office itself, and ties back to this document, the fraudulent donation of Constantine, in which the popes claimed for themselves earthly power rather than seeing their office as an opportunity to shepherd and pastor the church through spiritual means. So if we come down in the notes then, just a little ways, we can see here that the papacy grows more and more corrupt. This is kind of an outline of some of the things that I've been discussing. So we have Adrian I, who ruled over a state church and was the first to be called Holy Father. And we have the introduction of nepotism, because now the papacy is more about being a king than it is about being a pastor. And Leo III, who we mentioned, succeeded Adrian. Upon coming to office, he made allegiance with Charlemagne. In 799, followers of Adrian met Leo in the streets because they represent rival groups, and assaulted him with the goal of depriving him of his eyes and his tongue. He fled to Charlemagne, who reinstated him in Rome. Then we have Pascal I, who was responsible for murdering 2 officers to get elected. Adrian II, who had an illegitimate son from the wife of one of his delegates. In reaction, the delegates stole the Pope's daughter and later murdered the Pope's wife and daughter. Stephen VII, who lasted 2 years and was murdered by John IX. John IX, who lasted 2 years and was killed by Leo V. Leo V, who lasted 2 months and was murdered by Christophagus. Christophagus, who became a pope for 1 year and was deposed. So over and over and over again throughout this time period, the papacy shows itself to be utterly corrupt. And the process that took place there is outlined to some degree, or detailed to some degree, by Chamberlain in his book, The Bad Popes. Sergius III killed Christophagus and was pope for 7 years, and then John XIV was murdered. And in all, from 880 to 1000, we have no less than 30 different popes who reigned for less than 2 years. Now, of course, there were more popes than that during that time period. But within that 120-year time period, there are 30 popes who reigned for less than 2 years, most of them being killed by the guy who became pope after them. So when you start, like what we were talking about yesterday, when you start to talk about papal succession and the purity of this line of succession from pope to pope to pope, it gets really, really difficult during this period of time to say that there is an unbroken line of succession, when usually the guy who succeeds the previous pope was not appointed by that previous pope, but actually represented a rival faction within Rome, and he probably murdered the previous pope in order to become the pope, and he himself will be murdered by the guy who will come after him. And so, as we see here, the papacy became a bone of contention among rival factions as pope murdered each other in order to become pope. Yep, David.
Catholic historians, they acknowledge that all this happened. How do they explain it theologically?
Yeah, the way that Catholic apologists explain this time period is they argue that the office of pope, the office itself, the position, that it transcends the person who occupies the position. So just because so-and-so was a bad person, that doesn't mean that the office of pope itself is illegitimate. So they would argue that the office transcends some of the bad people who occupied the office. Maybe like we would say, perhaps there's a president in our history who we really don't like, and we would say, well, that president was a bad person, but the office of presidency transcends the character of the person who occupies the office. That might be an argument that somebody would make with regard to American politics. Catholics make the same argument with regard to the papacy and their history. But I think there's some serious problems with that, especially when you talk about papal succession, because the idea of papal succession is that Peter appointed his successor, and then the next pope appointed his successor, and so on and so on and so on and so on. It's all appointment based. When we get to this time period, these guys are not appointed by their successor. They are brutally claiming the office for themselves, usually by bloodshed and usually in opposition to the wishes of their predecessor. All right, I want to go back up just for a moment and talk a little bit about Charlemagne just in the final few minutes that we have. So we're talking about Charlemagne here, and then we're talking about papal corruption. And I realized that on the papal corruption side of things, I gave you more information than I was able to go through in a detailed fashion. But I just wanted to point you in the direction of that book by Chamberlain, The Bad Popes, in case this is something that interests you and you want to follow up on in more detail. You can find it there. There's also an author named William Manchester who has written about some of the same time period in his book called A World Lit Only by Fire. So if you're interested in some of the stories of these medieval popes and just how brutal it was, there's even a time when many historians believe that there was a female pope who pretended to be a man, though the Catholic Church officially denies it. So you can read about all of that if you're interested in it in this book, The Bad Popes, or in William Manchester's book, A World Lit Only by Fire. I think it serves as a fascinating apologetic against Roman Catholic claims for the supremacy of the papal office. But we need to talk just a little bit about Charlemagne in the minutes that we have remaining. Charlemagne's reign ushered in a renaissance of sorts, and Christopher Catherwood, who's the grandson of Martin Lloyd-Jones, wrote a helpful little book of church history called Church History, a Crash Course for the Curious. And he talks a little bit about the rise of monasticism and even how monks had kind of safeguarded culture and Christian scholarship during this early period of time when the feudal system meant that most people in society were either knights or farmers, peasants or soldiers. Scholarship was preserved through the monasteries. He talks a little bit about that in that period of time. The one thing I wanted to end on, though, is how are evangelicals to assess this period of Christian development? And I think it goes back to a question that was asked earlier about is the gospel lost during this time period? And what are we to make about some of these European tribal groups that suddenly convert en masse to Christianity? The Angles and the Saxons, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths in Spain, and then even the Lombards and the Franks. What are we to make of this? You know, the entire tribe, if the leader becomes a Christian, the entire tribe becomes a Christian. How are we supposed to assess this period of time? I think Christopher Catherwood has a helpful answer for us, and I want to just read this to you as we bring our time to a close. He says this: in Western and Central Europe, the great edifice of Roman power collapsed, with nothing solid to succeed it until 800. In that year, the ruler of the Franks, Charles the Great, declared himself to be Holy Roman Emperor. It was technically Leo III who declared him Holy Roman Emperor, but he certainly bestowed upon himself that same title. One key point needs to be made for us as evangelical Christians. Do we believe that no one was saved, born again, and went to heaven in that 1,000-year period of time? It is important to contemplate this theologically. We rightly revere, look back to, and defend the Reformation. But in so doing, we need to be careful about saying that there were no Christians over so long a prior time frame. Surely we cannot say that whatever the doctrinal quirks of the medieval church, and we will not deny them, that no one was redeemed for over a millennium. And we certainly would not say that. What secular historians call late antiquity, the time between the fall of Rome and the origins of the Holy Roman Empire, was a period of slow but steady conversions as pagan peoples heard the gospel for the first time and became Christians. We have looked at some of this already in considering how England became Christian, and the same gradual process took place in other parts of Western Europe as well. Brave monks would venture into the great forests. Some would be martyred, and others proved successful, with one of the biggest tribes, the Franks, converting around 496. When we talk of peoples becoming Christian, we need to recall that similar large-scale conversions of people groups still occur, often now in less developed parts of the world. We may feel more comfortable with individual conversions, and one does wonder at the authenticity of so many in a single ethnic or similar group professing faith simultaneously. Yet it does seem that such things can be genuine if God is truly behind them. And I think of, the city of Nineveh at the preaching of Jonah as an example in Scripture of something similar. Also growing rapidly at this time was the power of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, since it was his office that was the one major remnant from the days of the Roman Empire, along with the order and stability that empire brought with it. Now that Western Europe was cut off politically, culturally, and increasingly theologically from other powerful centers of ancient Christianity, those who deemed themselves the Pope's equals were far removed, and the Pope's power in Western Europe grew accordingly. And as we've seen, that power took on a distinctly political aspect, and as a result, the office immediately and inevitably began to be corrupted, and that corruption only increases over the next few centuries. And it'll reach its height, both in terms of power and in terms of corruption, really in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. And part of the reason the Pope is able to organize a crusade is because of the political clout that he garners in the 13th and 14th centuries. Okay, so we'll talk about that more, but it's important for me that you understand the process that is taking place here, a gradual corruption of the papacy that ultimately will lead to the absolute necessity for reformation.